Blood streaked across the horizon of history, yet no empire wrote the tale. They came like smoke and thunder, faceless riders spilling out of the steppe, bows drawn, arrows whispering death across kingdoms that thought themselves eternal. Persia trembled. Greek cities fortified their walls. Even Assyria, ruthless and unbending, faltered under their sudden storm. The Scythians, phantoms on horseback, vanished as swiftly as they struck, leaving only scorched earth, shattered armies, and a silence heavy with awe. But beneath the grasslands where their hoofbeats faded lie tombs of impossible wealth, kurgans filled with gold hammered into shapes of snarling beasts, artifacts that should not exist, craftsmanship that defies the reach of a nomad's hand. Who forged these wonders? Warriors? Shamans? Something more? Herodotus wrote of rituals steeped in smoke and blood, of kings buried with servants, horses, and fire. He wrote as if afraid of what he saw or what he dared not say. The winds of the steppe still whisper their name, but listen closely, and the sound carries something darker. Not history, but a warning. A people who ruled with speed, vanished with shadow, and left behind a question sharp enough to cut through centuries. The Eurasian steppe stretches like an unbroken ocean of grass, a corridor of power and peril that shaped civilizations long before they learned to write their names in stone. In this vast and merciless expanse, around the 9th century BCE, a people emerged who would alter the course of ancient warfare and carve their legacy, not in walls or cities, but in motion and fear. They were called the Scythians, by their enemies, by Greek chroniclers, by those who tried and failed to confine them. To themselves, they were simply the riders who had mastered the steppe. Archaeological traces place their early presence in the region north of the Black Sea, where Ukraine and southern Russia now lie, a land of rolling plains ideal for horses but merciless for those who stood still. Here, fragments of arrowheads, burial mounds, and fragments of woven cloth, preserved in permafrost and sealed tombs, speak to a society already distinct, already nomadic, already driven by a rhythm of speed and survival. These were not settlers building walls. They were riders perfecting a way of life so fluid it defied the permanence of stone. The first whispers of their name reach history through Assyrian records, carved into clay tablets around the late 8th century BCE. In these accounts, they appear not as a stable kingdom or known tribe, but as an unnamed threat sweeping toward the northern fringes of the Near East. The Assyrians, veterans of brutal campaigns and unmatched in siege warfare, recognized something alien in these mounted raiders. Something fast, precise, and utterly unpredictable. By the time Greek authors, particularly Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, wrote of them, their image had already hardened into legend. Nomadic lords of the grasslands, archers who struck from a gallop, a people who lived in the saddle and vanished into the horizon before an army could respond. Their mastery of the horse was no accident. Generations of herding, hunting, and warfare forged a people who treated riding not as skill but as instinct. The horse was more than transport, it was weapon, shield, and lifeline. Unlike the cavalry of settled empires, the Scythians did not rely on heavy armor or long engagements. They fought with composite bows, weapons of wood, horn, and sinew layered with precision to bend far more powerfully than simple wooden bows. Short enough to fire from horseback yet strong enough to pierce armor, these bows transformed every Scythian rider into a mobile marksman capable of raining arrows in swift, circling assaults. The technique was as startling as the technology. A Scythian attack often began with feigned retreat, a tactic designed to draw enemies into disordered pursuit. Then, with a sudden turn, the riders unleashed volleys of arrows, shooting even while twisting backward in full gallop, a feat later known as the Parthian shot, though the Scythians perfected it centuries earlier. No formation could hold against a storm that came from every angle, then dissolved before a counterstrike. Armies trained for rigid battle lines found themselves bleeding out in chaos, their ranks broken by shadows on horseback. Yet these riders were not merely raiders. Their burial mounds, known as kurgans, reveal a society far more complex than the quick strikes of war might suggest. Excavations have uncovered finely worked gold ornaments depicting stags, panthers, griffins, and horses frozen mid-leap. The craftsmanship reflects not only wealth but a symbolic language, power, vitality, and a reverence for the animal world that defined their existence. Even in this early period, their art carries precision that speaks to contact with skilled artisans of neighboring cultures, particularly Greek colonies along the Black Sea, but shaped by a fierce aesthetic of their own. The Scythians' presence reverberated beyond the steppe. By the 7th century BCE, their influence reached into the politics of empires. Assyrian records hint at Scythian alliances and conflicts with the Cimmerians, another nomadic people, during campaigns that struck fear across Anatolia and the Levant. For a time, Scythian warriors were even hired as mercenaries by Assyrian kings, an acknowledgement of their skill and a sign of the uneasy relationship between settled states and the nomadic world that threatened to consume them. But alliances with steppe riders rarely lasted. By the late 7th century BCE, Scythian groups pushed into the territories of the Medes and Persians, clashing with forces that would later build empires of their own. Greek awareness of the Scythians grew rapidly from this point. Colonies such as Olbia and Chersonesus traded grain, livestock, and luxury goods with them, exchanging artistry and ideas in return for access to the resources of the interior. But these interactions were laced with caution. Herodotus, though writing centuries later, preserved the memory of a people both feared and admired. A society without walls, kings buried with attendants and horses, warriors hardened by life on the move, and archers who could cut down infantry before they could lift a shield. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the Scythians were no longer a distant threat but a defining force across the northern Black Sea region. Their mobility gave them reach. Their bows gave them supremacy. They held no cities, left no temples of stone, yet empires recorded their raids with the same urgency reserved for earthquakes or storms. They were not invaders in the conventional sense. They were an element, wild, moving, and untamed, reshaping the frontier between the known and the unknown, between the static and the unstoppable. And yet, their story was only beginning. War, for the Scythians, was not bound by walls, roads, or rules. It moved with the hooves of their horses, struck without warning, and vanished before an enemy could form a line of defense. Their military system was not built upon the rigid formations of settled empires, nor upon the heavy armor of slow-moving armies. It was built upon motion, precision, and an understanding of fear as a weapon sharper than any blade. The core of Scythian warfare was the mounted archer, an innovation that turned speed into lethality. Their composite bows, crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, were masterpieces of ancient engineering. Short and recurved, they could be fired from horseback without losing power, capable of propelling arrows with enough force to pierce leather armor and, at close range, even bronze. Archaeological evidence from burial sites, such as those at Pazyryk and Arzan, shows bow fragments reinforced with bone plates and sinew bindings, preserving their elasticity for years of use. These weapons, compact yet deadly, allowed a rider to strike in rapid succession while maneuvering across open terrain. Their tactics centered on mobility. A Scythian force did not meet its enemy head-on. It unraveled them. They employed hit-and-run raids, luring infantry or heavy cavalry into pursuit before breaking into separate lines and circling back, raining arrows into disorganized ranks. The technique required extraordinary skill. The infamous turn-back shot demanded that a rider twist fully around at full gallop, loosing arrows with accuracy while retreating at speed. This method, later adopted by the Parthians and famously called the Parthian shot, was already perfected by the Scythians centuries earlier. Fear was as deliberate a weapon as the bow. Raids came without warning, often at night or during vulnerable moments of an enemy's movement. Scythian arrows were small but barbed, designed to tear flesh in ways difficult to treat, inflicting wounds that bled as much in morale as in body. Ancient writers spoke of arrows of fear, a phrase reflecting not only the physical harm but the psychological shock of facing an enemy who appeared like a storm, struck, and vanished before retaliation. To fight the Scythians was to fight shadows, every horizon a threat, every silence a warning. The Assyrians, renowned for their brutal campaigns and professional armies, were among the first to encounter these tactics in the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE. Their records, etched in cuneiform, hint at both alliances and conflicts with Scythian groups. On occasion, Assyrian kings enlisted Scythian warriors as mercenaries, valuing their speed and precision in campaigns against other nomadic peoples such as the Cimmerians. But the relationship was unstable. Scythian loyalty lay with mobility and opportunity, not with imperial hierarchies. Once the tides shifted, so did their alliances, and raids against Near Eastern frontiers became inevitable. By the late 7th century BCE, the Scythians had reached as far as Media and Persia. According to Herodotus, around 653 BCE, they swept through the region with devastating effect, holding dominance over parts of Western Asia for nearly 3 decades. Though the details remain debated, archaeological traces of Scythian-style arrowheads in areas corresponding to early Median settlements suggest that these raids were not isolated incidents but sustained campaigns. Unlike traditional invasions, which sought to occupy cities and hold territory, Scythian operations aimed to destabilize, plunder, and vanish, leaving empires scrambling to rebuild their defenses while preparing for the next strike. Greek colonies along the northern Black Sea soon experienced this style of warfare firsthand. While trade linked Scythians and Greeks, grain, metalwork, and horses exchanged for wine, olive oil, and luxury goods, conflict was never far. Greek accounts describe raids that burned crops, destroyed outlying settlements, and drove colonists behind fortified walls, where they watched the steppe riders vanish back into the horizon. Yet Greek artisans also absorbed elements of Scythian warfare into their own iconography, depicting mounted archers with composite bows on pottery and metalwork, a sign of both fear and fascination with these nomads. The precision of Scythian warfare left a legacy that outlived their own prominence. By the 3rd century BCE, the Sarmatians, related steppe peoples, adopted similar tactics, refining the use of cavalry and later introducing heavier armored riders to complement the archers' speed. Centuries later, the Huns would carry the essence of Scythian strategy westward, employing the same principles of speed, mobility, and psychological terror to shatter Roman defenses in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. The echoes of Scythian methods would resurface again with the Magyars and Mongols, proving that the mounted archer was not a relic of a lost age but a template for nomadic warfare across 1,000 years. Archaeological evidence confirms the military discipline behind this way of war. Scythian burials often contained entire arsenals, quivers with bronze-tipped arrows, bows carefully preserved, short swords and daggers for close combat, and even scale armor fashioned from overlapping plates of metal or hardened leather. Horses, buried alongside their riders, were adorned with elaborate bridles and decorative gear, indicating their importance not only in life but in death. These finds reflect more than mere equipment. They reveal a society where warfare was inseparable from identity, where every rider was both hunter and soldier, every weapon a piece of cultural memory. Their military legacy remains tied to their understanding of the steppe itself, a theater of war without borders, where speed was life and stillness was defeat. The grasslands offered no fortresses, no walls to hide behind, only the endless horizon where survival belonged to those who moved first, struck hardest, and vanished fastest. Across the vast steppe, the dead of the Scythians did not vanish into the soil without trace. They rose in monuments, kurgans, burial mounds that punctuate the grasslands of Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan like silent watchtowers of memory. Each one, whether a modest rise or a towering mound more than 20 meters high, was more than a grave. It was a statement of power, a repository of wealth, and a coded message to the future, that these were not wandering raiders, but a people who understood life, death, and the permanence of legacy. The earliest kurgans, dating to the 9th to 8th centuries BCE, were simple structures, covering timber chambers where chiefs were laid to rest with weapons and horses. But as Scythian society grew more stratified, their burial mounds evolved into staggering displays of wealth and ritual. Excavations have revealed chambers lined with planks, sealed with layers of earth and stone, and filled with offerings, artifacts of gold, intricate weaponry, ceremonial harnesses, and in some cases, entire sacrificial retinues of attendants and animals meant to serve their master beyond death. The craftsmanship of the gold found within these tombs defies the image of the Scythians as mere warriors of the steppe. At sites such as Saloka in Ukraine and Arzan in Tuva, archaeologists have unearthed jewelry, plaques, and ornaments depicting animals with exquisite precision. Stags leaping mid-stride, panthers poised to strike, griffins tearing into prey. Many of these pieces are no larger than a palm, yet carved with astonishing detail, the musculature of the creatures rendered in gold with lifelike curves and textures. The designs reflect a belief system rooted in the animal world, where power, vitality, and the liminal boundary between life and death were expressed through the forms of beasts both real and mythical. Weapons were often equally ornate. Short swords and daggers, their hilts encrusted with gold or inlaid with precious stones, accompanied the dead into their chambers. Quivers filled with bronze-tipped arrows rested beside composite bows, suggesting that even in death, a warrior might need his arms ready. The inclusion of finely crafted horse gear, bits, bridles, and elaborate decorative plaques underscored the inseparability of rider and mount, even beyond the mortal horizon. Some kurgans contained the bodies of sacrificed horses, arranged with care, their remains adorned with golden fittings, their purpose clear: to carry their master into the afterlife. The sheer volume of gold has stunned archaeologists. The Koloba mound near Kerch, dated to the 4th century BCE, yielded a collection including a massive gold cup, necklaces of twisted strands, and plaques embossed with scenes of combat and ritual. In Pazyryk, frozen tombs revealed textiles alongside golden ornaments, evidence that the Scythians valued not only precious metal but the artistry of dyed fabrics, intricate felts, and leatherwork preserved by the Siberian permafrost for over 2 millennia. These treasures are more than displays of wealth. They are maps of social hierarchy. The grandest kurgans belong to royal or noble figures, buried with entire households, weapons of ceremonial as well as practical use, and symbols of authority wrought in precious metal. Lesser mounds, while simpler, still contained personal ornaments, tools, and food offerings, evidence of a shared belief in an afterlife that required both sustenance and symbols of status. This hierarchy suggests a society capable of complex organization, one where leadership commanded loyalty not only in life but in the rituals of death. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, recorded accounts of Scythian funerary customs, describing the embalming of rulers, the procession of mourners, and the sacrifices made at the burial mound. Though some details in his narrative remain debated, archaeological evidence supports elements of his description, including the presence of human remains believed to belong to sacrificed attendants. The construction of these mounds required significant labor and planning, further demonstrating that Scythian communities could mobilize large groups for ceremonial purposes, a striking contrast to the image of nomads as perpetually transient and disorganized. Modern archaeology has brought these findings into sharp focus. Since the 18th century, expeditions across the Eurasian steppe have uncovered hundreds of Scythian burial mounds, their contents preserved in museums such as the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, where golden plaques, weaponry, and ceremonial gear form one of the world's most significant collections of steppe art. In the 20th century, excavations at Arzan, II in Tuva revealed more than 9,000 individual gold pieces, including plaques, pendants, and intricate jewelry, their combined weight exceeding 20 kilograms, evidence of wealth concentrated among Scythian elites and a testament to the high craftsmanship of their artisans. The animal style of Scythian goldwork, marked by dynamic movement, curling horns, and muscular tension, was more than decorative. It expressed a cosmology where life, death, and transformation were intertwined. Stags, often shown with exaggerated antlers, symbolized regeneration. Predators like panthers and griffins represented power and ferocity. Such motifs recur across burial sites separated by thousands of kilometers, suggesting a shared symbolic language across the Scythian world, uniting tribes that roamed from the northern Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. Some kurgans hold secrets beyond gold. Frozen tombs at Pazyryk have preserved tattooed skin, wooden coffins, chariots, and even the remains of garments dyed in vivid colors: reds, blues, and yellows that survived more than 2 millennia locked in ice. These finds reveal not only the wealth of the Scythian elite but the technical skill of their artisans, whose ability to work in gold, felt, leather, and wood points to a culture deeply invested in symbolic and material sophistication. Each mound, once sealed, stood as a monument against time, yet many were plundered in antiquity. Still, enough remained untouched to provide a clear vision of the world that built them. A world of mobility and war, but also of artistry and belief, where death was not an end but a passage requiring preparation as meticulous as life itself. The Scythians occupied a landscape too vast to be confined by borders and too fluid to be claimed by empires. Their territory stretched across the Pontic steppe, a corridor between the civilizations of the Mediterranean and the powers of Persia and Central Asia. From the 7th century BCE onward, this expanse became more than a nomadic homeland. It became a bridge of exchange, a zone where goods, ideas, and artistry moved between worlds that otherwise collided only in war. Greek colonies along the northern Black Sea, Olbia, Chersonesus, Panticapaeum, emerged as points of contact. Founded in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, these settlements became gateways for grain, honey, livestock, and furs flowing out of the steppe, while wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and luxury items poured in from the Aegean world. Archaeological finds from Olbia include Greek amphorae, bronze vessels, and imported jewelry buried alongside Scythian warriors. Evidence of a trade relationship built not only on necessity but on mutual recognition of wealth and skill. Yet this exchange was more than economic. Greek artistry left its mark on Scythian metalwork, influencing designs while never displacing the fierce animal motifs that defined their visual language. Golden plaques from kurgans near the Black Sea show a synthesis of styles. Greek-inspired techniques of relief and perspective fused with the raw dynamism of Scythian animal imagery. Scenes of stags, griffins, and felines, once hammered in geometric abstraction, began to display musculature and movement echoing the Hellenic eye for realism. These artifacts, found in sites such as Koloba and Chertomlik, prove that the Scythians did not merely trade gold with Greek craftsmen. They absorbed and adapted external influences into a distinctly nomadic aesthetic. Beyond artistry, the Scythians facilitated connections between far-flung regions. Their mobility across the steppe placed them along early trade arteries that would, centuries later, crystallize into the Silk Road. While the formal network of Silk Road routes is generally dated to the late 2nd century BCE under the Han Dynasty, archaeological evidence suggests that goods from Central Asia and beyond were already reaching the Black Sea region through nomadic intermediaries centuries earlier. Fragments of silk, found in Scythian burials such as Pazyryk, 4th to 3rd century BCE, trace their origin to Chinese production, indicating that the Scythians participated in long-distance exchanges long before the term Silk Road had meaning. Persia, too, intersected with the Scythian world. During the reign of Darius I, 522 to 486 BCE, Persian expansion into the northern Black Sea region brought direct encounters with the Scythians, recorded in Herodotus accounts of the Persian campaign around 513 BCE. While Darius sought conquest, he also sought access to trade routes that Scythian riders controlled. The steppe was not a barrier. It was a living network, carrying gold, textiles, spices, and knowledge from one civilization to another through the hands of nomadic traders and warriors who understood its paths better than any empire. The scale of this network can be measured not only in artifacts but in cultural transmission. Greek coins appear in Scythian burial sites far inland, while Scythian-style horse gear and weaponry influenced neighboring cultures, including the Thracians and Sarmatians. The fluid movement of ideas is evident in pottery, jewelry, and decorative motifs that blend Mediterranean and steppe traditions, a testament to constant exchange across cultural frontiers. Archaeological work has continued to expand this understanding. Finds from the Hermitage Museum collections, including Scythian gold shaped with Greek-inspired precision, stand alongside imported amphorae and bronze vessels that once carried wine or oil from distant ports. Each object bears silent witness to a world where trade flowed not along paved roads or guarded caravans, but through the swift movements of mounted traders who knew no fixed borders. This exchange also carried intangible goods, ritual practices, myths, and symbols. Animal motifs in Scythian art share striking parallels with Near Eastern and Central Asian iconography, suggesting a symbolic dialogue carried across hundreds of miles. The griffin, a creature that appears frequently in Scythian goldwork, has origins in Near Eastern myth, while the rendering of its musculature and stance reflects Greek artistic influence. These layers of style speak to more than trade. They reveal a world where objects carried not only value but meaning shaped by contact, barter, and mutual adaptation. Yet the Scythians did not dissolve into the cultures they traded with. Their burial mounds preserve a distinct identity, one rooted in the mobility of the steppe, the cult of the horse, and the fierce energy of their animal style. The Greek influence sharpened their craftsmanship, Persian contacts expanded their trade horizons, and long-distance exchanges brought silk and other exotic goods into their world. But each piece, however refined, retained the raw force of a people who lived and moved between empires, never belonging to one, yet shaping the fate of all. The spiritual world of the Scythians was neither silent nor distant. It was immediate, visceral, and bound to every breath of the steppe. Their rituals carried the weight of survival, their symbols burned with meaning, and their beliefs, recorded by ancient observers and confirmed by archaeology, reveal a culture where the visible and invisible were inseparable. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, offers one of the earliest written accounts of Scythian religious life. He describes a pantheon led by Tebete, a goddess associated with fire, whose sacred flame was said to be kept perpetually burning. Fire, for the Scythians, was more than an element. It was a living force, a conduit between the mortal world and the divine. Herodotus names other deities, Papeos, resembling Zeus, Api, the earth goddess, and a god of war whom the Scythians honored not with temples, but with altars of sacrifice and iron symbols of power. While Herodotus' interpretations reflect Greek analogies, his narrative preserves glimpses of a spiritual framework rooted in nature, warfare, and the rhythms of nomadic life. Ritual practice often involved substances that heighten sensory experience. Archaeological finds from Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains provide physical evidence of hemp seeds, braziers, and wooden containers associated with burial rites, suggesting that cannabis smoke played a role in Scythian ceremonies. Herodotus describes warriors purifying themselves by inhaling vapor from hemp seeds placed upon heated stones inside tent-like enclosures, an act not merely recreational but ceremonial, a means of cleansing, communing, and crossing thresholds between states of being. Sacrifice occupied a prominent place in these rites, though its nature remains debated. Herodotus recounts human offerings made to the god of war, describing mounds of brushwood where victims were slain and left as part of sacred obligations. Yet, archaeology paints a more nuanced picture. While some Scythian burials, such as those at Arzan and Pazyryk, contain multiple human remains, interpreted by some scholars as attendant sacrifice to accompany a chief or noble, other evidence suggests these may represent familial or communal burials rather than ritual killings. Nonetheless, the presence of horses, often dozens at a single site, buried alongside their masters with ornate harnesses and decorative plaques, confirms that animal sacrifice was a deeply ingrained practice, symbolizing status and the continuation of life beyond death. The imagery found in Scythian art reflects the spiritual themes that underpinned these rituals. Golden plaques depict stags with curling antlers, felines poised for attack, and griffins tearing at prey, creatures frozen in dynamic struggle, embodying forces of vitality, protection, and transformation. The stag, a frequent motif, has been interpreted as a symbol of renewal and the cyclical nature of existence. Its antlers, branching like trees, suggest a link between earth and sky, life and afterlife. The griffin, drawn from Near Eastern mythology, may have represented a guardian of sacred realms or treasures, its fierce form resonating with Scythian notions of power and vigilance. Shamanistic practices likely formed the backbone of Scythian spiritual life. Evidence from preserved burials indicates the presence of ritual specialists, individuals buried with unusual assemblages of objects, such as wooden drums, carved figurines, and small pouches containing herbs and pigments. These items, combined with the hallucinogenic properties of cannabis, suggest altered states of consciousness were part of ritual life, enabling communication with spirits, guidance in warfare, or healing in times of sickness. The role of such figures would have been crucial in a society where survival depended as much on the interpretation of signs and omens as on the skill of the bow. Even warfare carried ritual overtones. Herodotus records that Scythian warriors drank the blood of their first slain enemy as a rite of passage, a practice that, whether literal or symbolic, speaks to the blending of battle and belief. Weapons found in burials, from gold-inlaid daggers to arrowheads arranged as offerings, reinforced the notion that martial prowess was sanctified, that the tools of war were also instruments of sacred duty. Archaeological work has provided critical insight into these practices. The frozen tombs of Pazyryk Preserve felt hangings embroidered with mythic scenes, creatures of composite form, warriors on horseback, symbols of cosmic order. These textiles, alongside the braziers, hemp residue, and intricate gold work, offer material proof of the spiritual complexity that ancient writers only partially captured. Each find extends the understanding of a people who saw no divide between the material and spiritual worlds, who carried their beliefs in their ornaments, their weapons, and the rituals that marked life, death, and the spaces between. The steppe itself shaped these practices. With no temples of stone, no permanent sanctuaries, Scythian ritual was carried out in open spaces, around sacred trees, near rivers, or upon constructed mounds and altars. Mobility defined not only their warfare but their worship. Their gods traveled with them, their symbols bound to objects of gold, bone, and fire rather than fixed structures. Each ritual, whether of sacrifice, purification, or burial, reinforced the unity of warrior, tribe, and world. A unity that carried them through centuries of conquest and migration, leaving traces of belief scattered across the grasslands where their kurgans still rise. By the 3rd century BCE, the Scythians, once masters of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, faced forces that no bowstring, no raid, no sudden strike could repel. Their dominance, built on mobility, archery, and an intimate knowledge of the grasslands, began to erode as rival nomadic groups pressed in from every direction, reshaping the map of the Eurasian frontier. The first of these rivals, the Sarmatians, emerged from the east, migrating westward across the Ural region and into Scythian-controlled lands around the lower Don and Dniester rivers. By the late 3rd century BCE, their arrival was no longer a distant threat but an immediate displacement. Archaeological evidence, including weapon styles and burial practices, shows a marked shift in steppe culture during this period. Sarmatian graves feature long, straight swords, replacing the curved aconakes of Scythian design, and distinct horse gear reflecting different riding techniques. These were not imitators of Scythian methods, they were competitors, bringing their own martial identity to the contested frontier. The pressure intensified across the 2nd century BCE as Sarmatian tribes expanded further into the Pontic steppe, occupying regions once controlled by Scythian confederations. Ancient sources suggest that the Scythians, now fragmented, retreated toward the Crimea and lower Dniester region, establishing smaller, fortified settlements rather than dominating open grasslands as they once had. Archaeological finds at sites like Neapolis Scythica near modern Simferopol, dated to the 2nd to 1st century BCE, indicate a shift from purely nomadic life to semi-urban centers with stone fortifications, evidence of a people forced to adapt to new realities, building walls where once only the horizon marked their boundaries. Yet the Sarmatians were not the only pressure. From the east, broader migratory waves began to ripple across Eurasia. By the 1st century CE, the emergence of new nomadic coalitions, groups that would eventually feed into the rise of the Huns, began to unsettle the established order of the steppe. Though the Huns would not appear in European historical records until the late 4th century CE, their precursors, possibly Xiongnu-related or other Inner Asian groups, were already reshaping trade routes and tribal alliances 2 centuries earlier, displacing smaller groups westward in a chain of migrations that ultimately swept into Scythian territory. Roman authors of the early centuries CE still mention Scythians, but increasingly the term became a geographical designation rather than an ethnic one, applied broadly to steppe peoples whose identities were shifting. By this stage, the Scythians were no longer the unified, bow-wielding power that had harassed Assyrian borders in the 7th century BCE or fought Persian armies under Darius I around 513 BCE. Instead, they were a diminished presence, clinging to strongholds in Crimea and along the Black Sea coast, trading with Greek colonies, and integrating into the growing influence of Rome. Crimea became their final bastion. The fortified city of Neapolis Scythica, active until the mid-3rd century CE, reveals a hybridized culture, Greek-style architecture, Roman goods, and yet distinctly Scythian burial customs. Tombs contain gold ornaments in the animal style of earlier centuries, yet alongside imported amphorae and coins, marking a society that had become both client and participant in the classical world. These remnants, however, do not signal strength but survival. The steppe, once their highway of conquest, had become a corridor for others, Sarmatians, Alans, Goths, and eventually Huns, who eclipsed the Scythian name with their own. By the mid-3rd century CE, Neapolis Scythica was destroyed, likely during Gothic incursions into Crimea. This marks the final archaeological horizon associated with a distinct Scythian polity. What followed was absorption into the Sarmatian groups that continued to dominate the region, into the Bosporan kingdom influenced by Rome, and ultimately into the broader fabric of nomadic and settled societies of the Black Sea and steppe. The legacy of the Scythians did not vanish with their political decline. Their burial mounds remained across Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan, monuments to a people whose art and martial traditions influenced those who came after. The Sarmatians inherited elements of their weaponry and mounted tactics, while the Huns, centuries later, would perfect the style of mounted warfare that the Scythians had pioneered. Yet the historical line that had once been sharp, tracing the rise of the horse lords across the steppes, now blurred, fading into the migrations and conflicts that defined late antiquity. The Scythians did not vanish from history when their power faded in the 3rd century CE. Their name lived on, echoing through chronicles, legends, and the shifting cultures of the steppe. Greek writers like Herodotus had already immortalized them centuries earlier, portraying a people as fierce in battle as they were skilled in craftsmanship. Roman historians later used the term loosely to describe various nomads, but the memory of the original Scythians carried weight, shaping perceptions of the steppe long after their disappearance as a distinct political force. Their influence on warfare was profound. The composite bow, perfected by Scythian archers by the 7th century BCE, was a weapon that defined steppe combat for nearly 2 millennia. Light, compact, and deadly accurate from horseback, it gave nomadic warriors the ability to strike at speed and from a distance, outmaneuvering the heavily armored infantry of settled empires. Sarmatians, Alans, and later the Huns, Avars, and Mongols all carried echoes of Scythian techniques, swift cavalry, flexible formations, and psychological warfare executed through precision strikes and sudden retreats. Even the Parthians of Persia adopted similar methods, leading to the famed Parthian shot, a tactic of feigned retreat followed by backward archery, rooted in earlier nomadic practices. The Scythians also left their mark on myth. Greek writers associated them with the Amazons, female warriors living on the edges of the known world. Excavations of Scythian kurgans across Ukraine and southern Russia have revealed the remains of women buried with weapons, composite bows, spears, and horse gear, confirming that some Scythian women participated in combat. These findings, particularly from the 20th and 21st centuries, provide archaeological grounding for ancient legends, revealing that the line between myth and history was far thinner than once believed. Art was another arena where their influence endured. Scythian goldwork, with its intricate animal motifs, became a visual language of the steppe. Stags, eagles, panthers, and griffins rendered in flowing curves and fierce detail reflected both a cosmological vision and a technical mastery in metallurgy. The Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg houses some of the finest examples. Gold plaques from the 4th century BCE excavated from royal burial mounds like those at Kaloba and Chertomlik, weighing hundreds of grams yet crafted with astonishing delicacy. These artifacts speak to a society where mobility did not preclude refinement, where warriors adorned their horses and garments with artistry as bold as their conquests. The modern rediscovery of the Scythians began in earnest during the 18th century. In 1715, Peter the Great initiated expeditions to collect ancient gold from burial mounds in southern Russia, establishing one of the earliest state-sponsored archaeological efforts in Europe. These expeditions brought to light treasures that challenged prevailing notions of nomadic life, revealing a culture as rich in craftsmanship as in military prowess. Throughout the 19th century, Russian archaeologists continued to excavate kurgans, often under harsh conditions, unearthing masterpieces like the gold comb from Saloka, depicting warriors in battle with exquisite realism. By the 20th century, systematic archaeology deepened the understanding of Scythian society, connecting the artifacts to broader patterns of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Excavations in Kazakhstan's Issyk-Kurgan in 1969 revealed the famous Golden Man, a young warrior clad in over 4,000 gold pieces, dating to the 5th century BCE, evidence of elite craftsmanship extending across the eastern reaches of the Scythian world. Similar finds in Tuva and the Altai Mountains expanded the geographical scope, confirming that Scythian-related cultures stretched deep into Central Asia. Modern science has added yet another layer. Advances in genetics have allowed researchers to study Scythian remains directly, tracing their ancestry to a mixture of Indo-Iranian and local steppe populations. Studies published in the early 21st century indicate a dynamic genetic history, with different Scythian groups showing varying degrees of admixture, reflecting centuries of mobility and contact across Eurasia. These findings reinforce the image of a people defined not by isolation, but by movement, adaptation, and exchange. A society that thrived on the vastness of the steppe and the routes that crossed it. Their rediscovery also reshaped perceptions of nomadic life itself. Once dismissed as transient and culturally barren, steppe societies are now recognized as crucial engines of exchange, of technology, art, and ideas, linking the ancient worlds of Greece, Persia, India, and China. The Scythians, with their gold, their bows, and their enduring legend, stand at the center of that recognition, not as relics of a vanished world, but as architects of a cultural legacy that still commands attention.